The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
Most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Look, you got to keep up with the changing face of technology. We're moving to remote. In a couple of weeks, we'll have enough content that we can just feed it into ChatGPT and do the podcast that way.
I reckon we should change the name to WFH.
Well, WFH or ChatGBL?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I like that.
Nice.
Love that.
Tēnā koutou katoa, this has gone by lunchtime on May the 24th of 2023. We are scattered around different parts of the motu today. Ben, Thomas, you're in Wairoa.
Yeah.
Would you like to give us a dispatch from Wairoa? Tell us the latest. How is everybody going? What is the mood?
Yeah, just an update from the regions for those City Hall policy analysts in Wellington doing the disaster response. Just if they want any idea of what's happening out in the real New Zealand. Wairoa, it's interesting. This is the first time I've been back since the cyclone, and it's interesting, I came down through the motorway from Taupo, to Napier, and so I went past sort of the Esk Valley, and it's wild seeing just how much sort of devastation is still there. As you go along the road, there's sort of there's almost. They look like almost sort of, ancient earthworks, sort of ramparts, outside people's homes. You can sort of see the ones who've had sort of more resource or more kind of maybe economic impetus to clean up their properties. But it's incredible seeing the sort of devastation that it wrought. Driving past and seeing basically a sort of cross section of a house. Almost like a kind of Simpsons comedy sort of thing of where the front has come off the house and you just see the rooms inside sort of thing. Wairoa itself, a lot of the houses still people have still not moved back into. Some sort of, strange little vignettes. I was talking to somebody who was walking down the path that leads all the way along the river, this very long riverside path, and she was walking along it and along it and along it, and it's like a trench. The silt from the river is still piled high, probably about waist height or so, something. And then there's this trench cut for the scenic concrete path, and then it just kind of ended. It's sort of in this, and so you either have to go back, like many hundreds of meters, or climb over the silt to sort of get out. The down on the main street, the riverside, looks like a sort of archaeological dig where they've uncovered some old emperor's ancient picnic tables.
The Pompeii of New Zealand.
Yeah. They're just sort of dug out in pits at the same sort of level as the rest of the silt. Look, still a lot of cleanup work to be done. And just, because it's easy to sort of think, you kind of think about the immediate disaster response and then the money allocated sort of in the budget and announcements, and, you kind of, scrub your hands and sort of think, well, that's that taken care of, and you forget, there's just a huge amount of material and physical work that still needs to be done in this region.
How are spirits? Do you have a sense of how spirits are? I mean, I know the mayor. What's the mayor's name? He's
Craig Little.
Been around a bit, and he was getting pretty frustrated, I think, with some of the lack of action on silt especially. But do you have a sense of what the spirit of the town is at the moment?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a pretty resilient town as far as I can tell. Things are, in terms of, people's day-to-day lives and attitudes and getting on with it, it's largely back to normal. But just with this extra burden of work, we have seen reports that there have been problems sort of getting money out the door. I think there was some complaints about the Chamber of Commerce down in Hawke's Bay. But look, it's but part of it is just that typical problem that we have in New Zealand of capacity. Do you have enough people and enough plant and machinery to do all this work? Just as an aside, I came up via the motorway from Napier, which is now open from the Esk Valley, and incredible to see these bridges that have been sort of put up where there were sort of whole bridges were sort of ruined and kind of washed out and stuff, and these kind of treacherous sort of Devil's Elbow, which is this very treacherous sort of kind of ravine, and I
wonder how it got that name. Maybe it was being a treacherous ravine,
and the work that and the work that's been done, sort of putting up either temporary bridges or the roadworks. Sort of, really makes you marvel about this amazing creature called man, doesn't it?
Speaking of amazing creatures called man, Annabelle Lee-Mather, where are you today? You're also virtually appearing on the podcast. Are you somewhere in the inner suburbs of Auckland?
I'm just trying to really connect mata o te whenua pāharakeke vibes, just to really feel how, Māori on the ground. So I've come to Ponsonby, and I'm in the stuff building on the corner of Ponsonby and Williamson Ave, and in the deli section, there's a lot of people, discussing the budget and that stuff's been really informative and educational. Yeah.
At the Ponsonby countdown, what's been the chatter about the $5 prescription waiver next to the magazine aisle and the drug dispensary?
Yeah, so long as people can get their hormone replacement therapy for cheaper, so they've got more money to spend on Prosecco, they're pretty stoked.
Yeah, the lip fill co-payment is a big talking point.
I've heard a couple of people ask if it extends to prescriptions from the Casey Clinic, but haven't been able to confirm that yet.
I should say a big thank you to members, also to Te Aihe Butler, who is here making us all sound plausible. Where's that dog barking? Is that on yours, Ben?
That's small.
I quite like it.
That's Heartland, New Zealand.
Yeah, that's so provincial. I love it.
It does sound a bit like, I thought Aihe's chucked in a little bit of dog barking just to make it really, really sound authentic. Hey, let's talk about the budget. Annabelle, it was built in advance as the no-frills budget. National called it the blowout budget. It was the challenge for Robertson was to thread that needle facing cost of living crisis, infrastructure challenges after the cyclone that we've just talked about, and to avoid fueling inflation, also chuck just a teeny little bit of sugar there for election year. What was your assessment of it all?
Yeah, it was quite a precarious balancing act, usually at this time in the election cycle, there'd be a massive lolly scramble of a budget, but with inflation they weren't able to do that. But I feel like there was enough in there for everyone that they could keep people happy, and at the same time it was a bit of a small target budget. There wasn't a lot that National could really climb into, and probably the thing that would have been the most open for criticism, National kind of ignored and went after the $5 prescription fee instead, which sort of backfired quite badly on them. So, I mean, I know in Te Ao Māori it's been well received. Iwi Leaders Forum seemed to like it. I attended a hui at Wātea Marae earlier this week actually, with the Māori ministers discussing the budget gains, and again, very well received out there. Yeah, obviously the Matatini news has been very well received. I saw Te Pāti Māori were sort of claiming credit for that as well. I think there's some areas where in a different economic environment would probably more strongly criticised by the left, like the 20 hours ECE that doesn't go far enough in the eyes of people who want to see the state fully fund early childhood education. But I think they've done a pretty good job given where we're at economically.
Ben Thomas.
Yeah, a lot of interesting sort of rhetorical sleight going on with the budget. We saw National calling it the blowout budget, which probably had a bit of an air of sort of pre-scripting to it. And it's not wrong, right? It predicts, heavy deficits, pretty significant deficits for the next couple of years. It does massively increase spending. A number of commentators have said, since COVID, there's been a real step change. The size of the state, the sort of baseline size of the state, has gone from about 28% of GDP to about 32%. Those are significant numbers. But I think Labour would be quite happy that it's been perceived as a no-frills, a home brand budget, a careful, a conservative budget, because the thing is they actually spent a lot more than they said they would be spending, because there were no sort of huge back pocket kind of announcements. I think it has sort of slipped past the public consciousness just, how much extra spending there is. In the old days, $600 million for free prescriptions and $1.2 billion for expanding early childhood education would not be seen as sort of, very modest kind of, bits and pieces or rats and mice. These are big spending initiatives. And maybe it's a consequence of how much COVID has sort of warped the electorate's expectations about big numbers. But I think in part it's just very careful management politically and, PR-wise by the government to sort of talk about how they're being very moderate. Well, every year that envelope of spending gets more and more and more. It sort of reminds me of, every payday sort of going like, well, that's okay because I am spending beyond my means, but I can pay it back out of my next pay. And then the next pay, you're like, well, we'll just roll it over and maybe like add another $50 to the overdraft. And incrementally, the amount of spending has actually really blown out. So National wasn't wrong with its attack line, but Labour have been so good at making it look like they're just sort of cautiously sort of shuffling forward.
Expectation management was effective, that's true. But then it's also fair to say, isn't it, that a Labour Party in an election year would normally be hoping to provide some rather chunkier rabbits than those ones that it did provide. It said they were very targeted and they're for example, were it not for the cyclone and circumstances, it wouldn't be crazy to imagine they would try something like a tax-free threshold, surely.
Yeah, maybe. The other thing to think about, though, is that people do often price in budget announcements. If you announce something at the budget, a lot of the time, people, especially if it's spending prior to the election, sure, you might get some goodwill from the public, but then the public might also think, well, what else have you got coming into the election? I think that's what the government is looking at. So they've given themselves, a lot of some big pots to sort of make big election promises. If you look at the Climate Resilience Fund, $6 billion, two modest sort of projects being funded out of it currently, but that's not a real fund, right? It's not. It doesn't have as far as I can tell, it doesn't have sort of dedicated officials assessing applications or anything like that. It's just a very responsible sounding and very focus group sort of name, Climate Resilience, that is just $6 billion set aside for the government to spend however it likes, which I would say would be, local projects that will win its sort of favour.
Sure, and some of the COVID pot ended up having a little bit of mission creep.
Vast
places What did you think, Ben, about the Annabelle touched on the national response to the prescription point, which did seem to be not calibrated as well as they might have liked. It was almost as if Labor said, here's an opportunity for you to say that you would actually like people to pay $5 for their prescriptions. And National said, all right, we'll say that. That and the initial response, I think, I found a lot of it very cut and paste, but that can sort of be forgiven, can't it, in the House, given they have hardly any time to cobble together a response, let alone go through the minutiae of the budget and the Treasury projections. But what did you make of the response as a whole, Ben?
The opposition gets a very truncated sort of lockup. I think they get an hour? I think they get either an hour or 2 hours, but they're very little time, to go through the actual, the budget. And
presumably don't get walked through it.
That's right. I think they have officials that sort of answer, but they don't have the government sort of telling you what the narrative will be, this is how we are selling it. You just kind of get the books dumped on you. Look, a little flat-footed on the prescription thing. The budget day is the government's day. It's their day for sort of selling their vision. The opposition usually doesn't get much airtime. They could have been a bit more elegant. There is a little bit of a gap between things. Christopher Luxon, you get the idea that certain things are obvious to him that he will then assume are obvious to everyone else, and he doesn't quite make the leap of sort of bridging his line, which will usually be pretty sensible, or at least coherent with his understanding of the issue to get that across. We saw that today with the CTU came out with, said that there was a blowout in National's tax policy, and what that meant was that because
the policy being the shifting of the
tax
marginal
brackets,
rates,
which National had previously costed about $6.6 billion over 4 or 5 years. The CTU said, well, look, in the budget, one of the things that comes out with the budget is new Treasury forecasts. Those forecast that wages would increase. That means that tax collection increases because more people move into higher brackets and start paying a higher percentage of their income at a higher tax rate. So the government collects that as tax. So if you're going to put a tax break on that, you're actually, that will cost you, quote unquote, $1.5 billion more dollars. And that's true as far as the maths is concerned. But that was sort of sold, as National, it's another accounting error. They've messed up. And Luxon, I heard him on Morning Report today, and he said, well, that's true. Of course, that's true.
To be fair to them, they've made that point themselves that those numbers will need to be. It's question is when they come out with those numbers. No,
that's right. But what I mean is Luxon, would be on RNZ, and he was with Guy and Espiner, a very good interviewer.
Yeah.
But it wasn't clear to me that Guy and Espiner was actually on top of what the CTU's claim meant. He seemed to think that there had been some sort of error or miscalculation, and Luxon didn't explain it. He just said, "Oh, no, that's true. Yeah. Of course, that's true."
I sometimes think he could afford to be a bit more technical and boring.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I think he probably does know his way through a P&L. I'm not sure because I've never, a little bit of kind of boring. I've been through the spreadsheet and this is what, just sort of speaking like someone who understands how to work their way through some accounts. I think people might respond to this in this bread and butter time.
Well, yeah, certainly his biggest selling point is that he's a business guy. People used to say this about John Key, who was a currency trader, right? Not an actual businessman. And people would say he's a business guy. I want somebody with business experience running the country during a recession, and that, that's a strong selling point for Luxon, particularly if things don't start getting better in terms of the general environment. Which we'll see. Touch wood for the OCR announcement today, which will probably have come out by the time this podcast does. But look. I just think there just seems to be something a little bit missing, whereby, they're not kind of taking the public with them on these sort of little traps, and I think they have to because, God bless our media, but they're not necessarily good at explaining these things in their products themselves. If you just looked at the
disagree.
Well,
disagree.
Well, if you looked at the headline of that the RNZ story, which was spoke to the CTU press release, it really did suggest that there was some kind of error in what National had proposed, as opposed to it's been updated because there's new figures.
We love a fiscal hole. There's nothing like a fiscal hole. It's like let's go fiscal hole hunting. What do you think, Annabelle? The leader of the opposition in his speech said addicted to spending, or a variation on that, 14 times. Is that a line that you think is going to bear fruit for the opposition? Now the budget's out of the way, there will be more of an opportunity to have a level playing field to some degree running into the October election. Is that a line that is going to hit home with voters?
I think probably the only person it's going to bear fruit for in terms of opposition is ACT. And I think Luxon's handling of the budget announcement is another glaring example of his inexperience and his inability to think on his feet and play a smart political game. When you're literally leading the headlines the day after budget as the leader of the opposition with a headline like National vows to reinstate the $5 prescription, you are not winning. So I think that actually the last week has been quite politically damaging for Luxon.
I was watching a speech, and by that point in the day you are going a little bit doolally, it's true, but I sort of felt as though maybe a better theme to tie it all together for National is that Labour has lost control. It just isn't as a narrative that they need to build in response. Tying together all the shortcomings around delivery, around spending, around discipline, around all of those things. But
what there is a new. So, there's two things about that. The first thing is everybody, I think, considered that Labour had really snookered National in the last budget in 2022. They had brought up their cost of living payment. There was a sort of feeling that the wily Grant Robertson had gotten the better of Christopher Luxon.
You mean the immediate response?
The immediate response, the day or the week afterwards. And, we kind of saw how that panned out, right, as the cost of living payment sort of spread around the world like the novel coronavirus, popping up in exotic locations, for, long dead French barristers' estates received it, and, Tibetan monks were bequeathed cost of living payments and stuff,
Kiwis and Florida zoos.
That's right.
The whole thing.
And so, again, you don't want to be like sort of like, Mao talking about the French Revolution, it's too soon to tell, but, you wouldn't sort of immediately write off the opposition because of last week's budget. But the other thing is, in terms of the slogans, I did notice a new one that came out last week. I saw it on a meme, a GIF, or what is it, the picture, the AI, Skynet, droids,
Net GPT.
Yeah,
is someone
and it said, let's get the country back on track. And they've just unveiled, I saw online, the Back on Track tour. And look, that's actually the most powerful language they can use, because as Stephen Mills from Talbot Mills will tell listeners of RNZ, at any opportunity, one of the most important indicators in terms of polling. He says the most important in terms of changing a government is the country on the right track or the wrong track. And those wrong track numbers on every public poll that we've seen have been negative for, a long time now. And so, forget about Chris versus Chris. They want to keep it on, reminding people, you think the country's on the wrong track and we can change that.
A classic and effective Tory line, back on track without sort of resorting to make New Zealand great again. It has connotations of returning to a previous idyll that may or may not have existed.
Well, no, I mean, I think, it's not really make America great again. It's a sort of, it's like fixing Auckland, another classic line.
Oh, that was a great line.
Another genius.
That was
rhetorical game.
That was our talismanic mayor, Wayne Brown.
Yeah.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
This is Climate Adaptation.
We are the Pōtiki of the Taiao.
And the words of those keeping the home fires burning.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place to the end of your life.
We have the solutions. We just need to come back to the belief in ourselves as rangatira.
Join me, Nadine Hura, and Ruia Āpirahama, the Kōpapa Korangi Series 2, Ahi Ka. Brought to you by Te Komato o Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge, out now on the Spin-Off Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, a few other things to rattle through. Let's talk quickly about the New Zealand steel deal that was announced on the weekend. Annabelle, $140 million to a foreign-owned company that banked about a $3 billion profit last year. On the surface, that seems crazy. Is it crazy or does it make sense?
I mean, it is crazy and it does make sense. Every government throws a bone to business. Usually it's farmers. And this time around, it just happens to be the steel mill, but it is going to have a massive impact. It's also a huge win for the Greens. I listened to James Shaw interview this week on RNZ. The argument for it is compelling. And can I say, as a taxpayer, I think most people would probably prefer that their tax money is being spent on this sort of subsidy than, say, funding the America's Cup, which then goes and races in Saudi Arabia. What I did find interesting, though, you would have thought that this is quite low-hanging fruit for the National Party and something that Luxon could have really spoke about with enormous authority. And so, again, just coming back to the $5 prescription issue, I'm not sure why they didn't focus their attack line more on this than the prescription subsidy.
It's an interesting one, isn't it, Ben? Because it gets so complicated in terms of the economics of it, because we've got this emission trading scheme where the carbon price moves around. And when you look at it on the basis of the emission cut, 800,000 tonnes at $16.20 a tonne is the way that the numbers come down. And that seems like money very well spent versus $55 or something for a tonne. But at the same time, the risk is you provide incentive to other polluting companies to just hang on and wait for the money to come from the ETS. New Zealand Steel weren't even paying into the ETS because they basically had the government, over one. Where do you sit on that? Is the system as a whole fit for purpose?
Yeah, so if you're a market purist, and this is where the emissions trading scheme came in, it was like, let's harness the power of the market to bring down emissions. We will create a market for carbon, since, we will say there's only a certain amount of carbon you're allowed to emit, so we create a market for it. That means that the permission to use a ton of carbon will find its way to the highest value use.
With a sinking lid on the number of units.
So if you want to use carbon, you're incentivized to find a profitable, high value use for it, not just something that's marginally profitable, and so you actually can't afford to emit the carbon to make that return. In theory, it works. There is a bit of a wrinkle. It was sort of thought that, part of the attraction of it was that you'd have all these sort of securitizations and derivatives and sophisticated financial instruments, which had been so successful in kind of making everybody rich in the world market. And that was the basis on which the ETS was campaigned on by National and Labour in 2008, just as the global economy was collapsing because of collateralized debt obligations and other sophisticated financial instruments.
There's markets.
But, that's the basis. It makes sense in a theoretical way, but here's how it makes sense. It makes sense by making low value, or, it makes sense by putting a cost on something that didn't used to have a cost. And it was always sold as, we'll all account our ways into a green economy and being carbon billionaires. And there would be no real work because the magic of the market would do it. But of course, the magic of the market achieves things in aggregate by forcing people out of business and creative destruction and, and adaptation and pivoting. And you've got to have an effective price of carbon to actually drive that. And the thing is, politically, nobody ever wants carbon to be expensive enough that they can be held accountable for that. As a government, as soon as somebody's suffering because of the carbon price, they will go to the media and they'll say, there's government regulations, screwing us. And even before the ETS was in effect, we saw all of these carve-outs and, And there are good reasons for some of them,
there's good reasons for this one because otherwise we'd get out all our steel from China where the right. Aggregate pollution would be greater. So
the aggregate pollution would be greater. You want security of supply. That became much more important to us during COVID. Marsden Point, that's a great example of something, that we lost the ability to do ourselves. And it was right as I bought a SodaStream machine and had a stranded asset because there was no domestic carbon dioxide supply. Yes. So I have seen a future, where we lack supply independence.
How is your air fryer, by the way? We haven't that hasn't come up much.
The air fryer, that's still going strong. It's good. I've got other appliances now.
Sorry, Bells, you had a question?
Oh, I was going to say, and it allows for the recycling of steel, like old cars and all of that stuff as well, which is important instead of relying solely on iron ore.
Yeah.
And look, I should say as a disclaimer, I've got clients who are in the same sort of sector of being sort of export exposed industries that are high carbon emitters and who can't easily decarbonize, just like New Zealand Steel. And look, who knows? There are arguments for it, right? There's arguments for New Zealand Steel, and look.
There are job arguments for one, which are very real ones, but also the sort of big bazooka is a 1% cut in emissions, which you have to sell an awful lot of Nissan Leafs to kind of get up to that level, and that's. It's non-trivial. That part of it is real. There are so many bits of these markets moving around that kind of numb my brain. But at least you can see there's something that feels
right.
real.
At some point, you have to reduce the amount of carbon you're emitting. Right? Like the accounting only gets you so far. The planting forest is a very good way of reducing emissions in the short term, but eventually you will run out of land and you'll all be, sort of huddled on.
Well, the other thing too is that actually this is another really interesting argument that while planting pines and that it might reduce carbon at the moment, if we find ourselves in a heat wave and New Zealand catches on fire like Australia has, then actually we become, our carbon forests become carbon emitters. So it's not a good long-term strategy anyway.
Just briefly, Chris Hipkins has been on a few sort of quick whistle-stop trips since he became Prime Minister, and this one was, I think, about 24 hours in Port Moresby, Annabelle. It was originally going to be the Joe show. Biden was going to be there. In the end, he did manage to meet the Indian Prime Minister, Modi. He met Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and he met Marape, the PNG Prime Minister. Was it a worthwhile trip? Do you have any strong views on that? At one point, he did seem to get feted like royalty, which must have been an interesting experience for him.
I always think it's worth our political leadership investing time in its relationships with the rest of the Pacific. So yeah, I think it's time well spent, especially as tension between China and the US grows in our part of the world, and unfortunately we're seeing Polynesians, Melanesians, and Micronesians squeeze between these superpowers.
Ben Thomas?
Yeah, look, this is just sort of part of the developing picture in the broader Asia Pacific, where we do seem to be sort of trending more and more towards sort of an alignment with our traditional allies. Yeah, and these are important things for him to do. I mean, again, I'd reiterate my the stark shock of seeing going from Jacinda Ardern, who really was a superstar on the world stage, to our fancy little gent Prime Minister who gets presented with little treats of Coke Zero and sausage rolls wherever he goes.
There were those scenes where he was being cheered. There were those scenes. It's all going. It's all on. And then, what's more, he had to fly back at 3:00 in the morning, go and do a media round, and do an hour of talkback with Kerry Woodham.
God.
So, honestly, who'd be a Prime Minister? Hey, from geopolitics is fine, but much more important, compelling, is what's been going on in Gore, which I don't think we've dealt with before. I don't know if we've properly served our listeners in Gore by solving what's going on down there. Has either of you been glued to the drama of Gore?
No, since the beginning.
Ben Bell, the youngest mayor ever, who came sort of locked horns with the CEO Stephen Parry, and came to a head in a council, and it was a bit of an anticlimax because there was meant to be a vote of confidence that didn't happen. What's your read on it then, Ben? What's your universal theory of the local politics of Gore?
Look, it's Southern Game of Thrones, right? I actually got sort of
Can I stop you there? I think it's not Game of Thrones. I'm thinking more like an icy, moody, Scandi-inspired political drama called Gorgon.
Oh, nice.
That's me. That's all I have.
That.
Carry on. Sorry.
When the first sort of rumblings came out, and there were talks that I think first the chief executive was on stress leave, then the mayor was on stress leave, and then the councillors voted out the deputy mayor, and they refused to pay for Ben Bell's team building retreat, whatever sort of Zoom nonsense he wanted.
His EAs coming up to Wellington with him was scrapped.
Vetoed that, and somebody DM'd and said, this has much further back roots. Ben Bell's mother, was a former Gore District Council employee, and she was in a long-running dispute with the chief executive, and with Tracy Hicks, the former mayor.
And someone is a flatmate with someone else who lives beside someone else who
and that really piqued my interest, because I sort of thought, well, that's very intriguing, that's very exciting. But then I discovered that the mother had been an employee sort of, I think, about a year and a half ago, and I was like, it would have been better if it was like 23 years ago. And then
it doesn't go deep enough.
And she had raised this child since birth as her angel of vengeance against the Gore District Council. Like that movie Salt with Angelina Jolie, trained in an underground camp to sort of but look, it just does seem like one of those things where, the chief executive probably had a pretty comfy little thing going on for a long time where he's sort of running his fiefdom. I think Andrea it was Neil Holdham, I think, maybe the New Plymouth mayor, said, this is an issue. We do need to sort of think about where do the council organisation fit in versus, the governing body of these things, which is what we think of as the council, the people that we vote, the people that 30% of us vote in every 3 years. And most of the power in these places is actually genuine, generally, especially if you've got a new mayor and a long-serving chief executive. Often the chief executive will just be running the whole thing. Certainly the case for somewhere like, historically, certainly the case for somewhere like Auckland Council.
Yeah.
And that's why...
And Wellington, where, those people you touched on, Andrew, you have perceptions of sort of administrative capture, really, and people are like, well, we understand this better than you guys, and they probably do. You guys just sort of happen to be one of the 3 or 4 randoms that accidentally got yourself elected onto the council or whatever. But still, there is, Annabelle, the kind of the elected is the important bit, right?
That's right. I read a really interesting article the other day which said that the average age for a regional or local body councillor in New Zealand is 65, but the median age of our population is 38. And I think what's happening in Gore kind of speaks to a wider problem that we have in local government, which I guess, to put it in the most simplest of terms, is boomers. There's just way too many boomers, and she's not the only Bell. He's not the only Bell that's having problems. I read an article about Bridget Bell, who's a young wahine Māori in the Manawatu, who's been experiencing racism, ageism, and sexism within her council. And I just think it's time that we round up the boomers and pop them into the home for the bewildered.
Round up the boomers and stand up for the bells.
Yeah. Bells of the world unite.
You're a bell, almost a bell. It's okay.
But the other thing, one thing that I did learn from Stephen Parry from reading the newsroom story and watching the Kristen Hall's amazing story on Sunday on TVNZ about it. Anytime anyone criticizes me from now, my only reply is going to come in word cloud form.
It is the whole
just
thing
going to be dotted around some credible, believable, hardworking, capable, and then in the middle fuck off.
Those words snuck in that were kind of, it seems a little bit, a little bit disingenuous. Kind of smaller words.
You're squinting. You're like, what's that in 4-point font? Stalked me to my London home.
Anyway, all very fine people, including boomers. If you listen to this and you're a boomer, I apologise for all that appalling slander. We love you dearly, and please don't cancel your spin-off memberships. We will return very soon with another podcast about politics. Anything else to add, anyone? I feel so distant from you when you're not in the studio. I feel empty. I feel sad.
It's very touching.
I'll still be on the road when the podcast comes out, so I can listen to it and give you guys quality assurance. I should be in Rotorua by then or something.
Can I send you the edit, Ben, so you can manually get rid of all of the dogs barking?
Oh my God.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spinoff. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spinoff member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spinoff. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spinoff member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spinoff Podcast Network.